And this Sicha from Chelik Chavav, Pars Tetzaveh, actually introduces us to a very interesting concept that we have the value and importance of the Mesoda of the Chachamim is much greater than even something that we see with our own eyes. And it's a very, very geschmack the way the Rebbe brings the practical applications on how we find this in halacha, etc. We'll start with number one, concerning the command, the mitzvah, that the Yidden were told to make the tzitz. The tzitz was the golden forehead plate worn by the Kohen Gadol. It says in the pasuk, you shall engrave upon it like the engraving of a seal. What does it say? The words you should engrave is Kodesh Lashem, holy unto Hashem. There's a difference of opinion in the Talmud between the sages, the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi, regarding the manner in which these two words are to be written on the tzitz. Kodesh Lashem, how exactly are they supposed to be written? The sages, the Chachamim maintain that these two words should be engraved in two lines. Yud K above, the letters Yud and Hey of Shem Yud K Vav K, and Kodesh and a Lamed below. In other words, Kodesh, Le, and the Hashem is on the top. As Rashi comments, this means Hashem's full name on the top line and the word Kodesh and the letter Lamed on the lower line. That is the opinion of the Chachamim. However, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi states, I saw it in the city of Rome. In other words, he managed to see the different spoils of war that the Romans had brought from the Beis Hamikdash into Rome, and the words Kodesh LaHashem were written on it in one line. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi holds that really it's supposed to be written in one line. Rambam rules upon it is written Kodesh LaHashem in two lines. In other words, the Rambam is ruling according to the majority opinion, according to the Chachamim. If, however, the words were written in one line, the way Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi said he saw it in Rome, it was valid. After the fact, b'diavad, it's kosher. And the Rambam adds to this, there were times when they were written in one line. Like we're soon going to explain, this is the meaning of how Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi saw it that way, even though we're saying that the halach is like a hachamim that was supposed to be written in two lines. So the Rambam explains there were times where even though it should have been ideally written in two lines, there were times when it was written in one line. And concerning that time, that's when Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi happened to see it, that model, that version he happened to see in Rome. From Rambam's ruling, we see that regardless of the testimony of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi, the Chachamim did not retract their position that the words are to be written in two lines. Therefore, Rambam rules according to the Chachamim. He merely adds, the Rambam adds, that after the fact, b'diavad, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi's words can be followed as halacha in case, it happened to be. That doesn't mean that the tzitz is invalid. Now, the Rebbe analyzes the words of the Rambam. In stating there were times when they were written in one line, the Rambam is referring to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi's testimony. That's what it means there were times. In other words, like Rabbi Yossi himself testified. He saw it. So there must have been times when it was that way. And emphasizing that it definitively indicates that after the fact, that tzitz is also acceptable, but the evid, it's also kosher if these words were written in one line. Meiri, which is another Rishon of the commentaries on the Gemara, explains, although one of the great Chachamim testified, I saw it in Rome and the words Kodesh LaHashem were written on it in one line, so one might think, once you have a testimony of someone of that stature, how could there be any doubt? So the Meiri explains, even his eyewitness testimony did not cause the Chachamim to contravene a tradition known to them. Meaning that since the Chachamim knew by Mesoda, by a Kabbalah that they had heard from the Chachamim preceding them, that this is the way it was supposed to be written. So regardless of what the Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi saw with his own eyes, that did not have as strength as much as the Kabbalah, as the tradition that the Chachamim had. So the Rebbe wants to analyze this. How is this so? On the surface, this is difficult to comprehend. We are speaking about the eyewitness testimony of one of the great Chachamim, like the Meiri calls him, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi. Certainly, there is no possibility of doubt, chas v'sholom, heaven forbid, regarding the veracity of his testimony. It's not that we would say that somehow Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi didn't understand, didn't know, didn't get it straight, etc., etc. In addition, according to the ruling of the Rambam as explained above, it follows that during those years when the two words were written on it in one line, in other words, because the Rambam says there were times, there were occasions when they wrote on one line, the sacrificial service of the Kohen Gadol and the atoning effect of that the tzitz had, even when not worn by the Kohen Gadol on his forehead, was performed with a tzitz that was acceptable only after the fact. This means as follows, that in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, the Kohen Gadol, when he offered the sacrifices, he wore all 8 garments of the Kohen Gadol, including the tzitz. So, and also there was a certain atonement that the tzitz had, even on its own, for the certain karbonos that were brought incorrectly. So there was a certain atonement that the tzitz had. So all of these functions that the tzitz had, that they validated, if you will, the Kohen Gadol sacrifices, that they atoned for certain things, seems to be that when we look at the Rambam, that was only done with a runner-up, with a b'diavad tzitz, which is very puzzling to understand and to say that the Kohen Gadol would use only something that is secondary when he needs to serve Hashem and he needs to do the offering in the best way possible. And the same thing that it had to atone, it doesn't really fit in with the devotion, etc., that what would be. Furthermore, when a practice performed in a given manner is acceptable after the fact, it's a b'diavad type of thing, that license is of a temporary nature. As soon as it is possible to perform it as required, one must do so. For example, in the case at hand, if a tzitz with the words Kodesh LaHashem inscribed in one line was acceptable only after the fact, it would be acceptable only for the time it would take to inscribe the 2 words Kodesh LaHashem in 2 lines on a golden forehead plate. Meaning, when you say that something is kosher after the fact, that means that as soon as possible, you're supposed to do it not b'diavad anymore. You're supposed to do it now l'chatchila. After the fact doesn't mean you can just keep on doing it this way. So therefore, in the Beis HaMikdash, whatever amount of time, whatever duration of time it would take to inscribe the words anew on a golden plate, on a golden forehead plate, that is how long one would be able to use this b'diavad type of tzitz, this after the fact type of tzitz. That would lead to a conclusion that is difficult to accept, that the Beis HaMikdash was conquered by the Romans and the tzitz captured in this extremely brief period of time. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi says that he saw in Rome this particular type of tzitz that was an after-the-fact type of tzitz. If he saw that in Rome, that means it was the Beis HaMikdash was conquered just in that short amount of time between when they had this b'diavad tzitz and when they were going to make the one for l'chatchila. That's very small and short amount of time. We should say that just happened to be that was when the Beis HaMikdash was conquered. So that's a difficult concept. So the Rebbe says, and too, the above point can be clarified by comparison to a similar issue which was discussed on the previous occasion at length, meaning the shape of the branches on the menorah. It's a whole different Sicha, the Rebbe talks about it. On the Arch of Triumph, built in Rome for Titus Yimach Shemoy, may his name be erased, after his conquest of Yerushalayim, is engraved an image of a menorah that some say depicts the menorah from the Beis HaMikdash. That menorah is shown with its branches rising upward from the center shaft, each pair forming a half circle. And from this, they want to prove that this was the design of the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash. On the surface, this image is a direct contradiction to the statements of the leading Torah authorities concerning the form of the menorah. Rashi explicitly writes that the menorah's branches would extend upward diagonally, meaning they would ascend at an angle in a straight line. Moreover, this is the meaning of the word kana in Hebrew. It says the kane ha-menorah. Kana, translated as a branch, meaning more like a reed, like you're soon going to say. In both Torah Shebeksav and Torah Shebapeh, that word of kana, branch, refers to a reed that grows upward in a straight line, as can be seen at the banks of any river. So it makes no sense really, there's no logic to assume that the branches coming out of the menorah, that he uses the term kana, which means reed. No reed isn't a half arc, bent on the corner, etc., etc. A reed is a straight thing coming out diagonally. Not only Rashi says this, but the Rambam as well. Similarly, Rambam, when personally drawing an illustration of the menorah in his commentary to the Mishnah, there's an actual depiction that the Rambam makes in his commentary in Mishnayos. As evident from the manuscript copies of that work, that we see that it's the Rambam's own writing, not just something that the printers put in for clarification, depicts its branches as ascending diagonally instead of in like a half a circle. His son, Rav Avram, the famous, well-known Rav Avram ben HaRambam, gave testimony that his father's depictions of the branches as rising in straight lines, not as semicircles, was intentional. So we have the Rambam drawing it that way, and someone could think that Rambam was making an easy way to illustrate it, a shortened version of illustrating it. But Avram, the son of the Rambam, said no, the Rambam meant to draw it that way in a straight line, not in a half curve or so on. The problem is the same thing with what Rebbe Eliezer ben Yossi saw in Rome versus what the Chachamim testified about the tzitz. The view of these authorities runs contrary to the depiction of the menorah on the aforementioned arch, which on the surface is based on eyewitness testimony. You would think that the reason why it's that way on the arch is because whoever drew it saw the menorah. It is possible to give a straightforward resolution for this issue between how could it be that we hold that the menorah had straight branches and the menorah on the arch in Rome is curved. The depiction of the menorah on the arch is not an accurate depiction of the menorah of the Beis HaMikdash. As can be seen, there are several other elements of that depiction which differ from our Chachamim's description of the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash. There's many details of the menorah, as we know. And yet, if you look at that picture, at that engraving on that arch, they don't seem to fit. A further indication of the inaccuracy of the depiction of the menorah on that arch is that it includes an image of a dragon, which obviously was not included in the menorah of the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, you can't say that this would be a perfect example of a testimony of what was actually drawn in the Beis HaMikdash, what was actually made in the Beis HaMikdash. Rather, what is that image that is depicted on the arch over there in Rome? So the Rebbe says, therefore it is logical to conclude that initially the depiction on the arch was not made as a copy of the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash, but rather as a copy of another menorah that bore certain similarities to the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash. Similarly, since the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash since the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash was a very important object, it was common for people to make menorahs which resembled it. The worshippers of false deities of Avodah Zarah in particular would make such copies for their own Avodah Zarahs. This explains why they added the image of a dragon, because the dragon was an Avodah Zarah, was a false deity. The depiction of the menorah on the arch was made based on one of those menorahs that was similar to the menorah of the Beis Hamikdash, but not identical. So therefore, the Rambam and Rashi can be correct that the menorah and the Beis Hamikdash were diagonal lines without any curve, and still in all, some of the menorahs that were captured in Rome by the Romans were with a curved branch. So he says in number 3, similar statements can be made with regard to Meiri's understanding of the words engraved on the tzitz. Although Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi saw a tzitz in Rome, there is no conclusive proof that it was the tzitz of the Kohen Gadol. Just like we said that the menorah that they depicted on the arch was not the actual menorah used in the Beis Hamikdash, the same thing what Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Eliezer saw could possibly be something else that was meant to look like it. It is possible that was an ornamental item that someone made in a form somewhat resembling the tzitz. Afterwards, for whatever reason, perhaps to save the true tzitz from falling into the Romans' hands, this ornament was placed together with the articles from the Beis Hamikdash was be taken to Rome. So similar statements can be made regarding the menorah. Perhaps, in other words, the menorah was hidden away somewhere, and they mixed in these other menorahs that looked like it, and the real tzitz was placed somewhere else so that the Romans don't take him and use it for their Avodah Zarah. And they put in this other tzitz that was like not the tzitz that was used in the Beis Hamikdash. That's what the Chachamim would say in defense of their view. In other words, they would say, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi, you're not lying. You saw what you saw. But what you saw was not what was used in the Beis Hamikdash, because people might have replaced it, etc. In particular, the above is plausible since the Isser, the prohibition, do not make an image with me. Loisasun iti, which our Chachamim interpret as forbidding making a house in the form of the Heichal. There's an Isser to make a building that looks identical to the Beis Hamikdash, the inner sanctuary of the Beis Hamikdash, or included in that is fashioning utensils identical to those used in the Beis Hamikdash. There's an Isser to make the shulchan that looks like the shulchan of the Beis Hamikdash, to make a mizbeach that looks like the mizbeach in the Beis Hamikdash, to make a menorah that's similar to the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. That's only concerning the building and the utensils, the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash. But there are those that say that this Isser does not apply to the big dekuna, to the priestly garments. Therefore, it's possible that someone made an ornament that resembled a tzitz. It would be no problem to do that. There was no Isser to do that. Now, this is not a definitive thing that there was no prohibition to make garments, big dekuna, similar to what was in the Beis Hamikdash. So the Rebbe says, even if one would venture to say that the prohibition, do not make an image with me, does apply in such an instance, it is possible that a non-Jew made a copy of the tzitz for whatever reason. Therefore, since the Chachamim had received the tradition, to quote Meiri, it was a tradition known to them that the words Kodesh LaHashem were written in 2 lines, it is assumed that this is the way it was written. They had that tradition. There was no question in their mind, once we had the Kabbalah, once we had the Masorah, the tradition that this was the way it was, so that's the way it was. Therefore, this accepted tradition that the Chachamim had compels us to say that the ornament Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi saw in Rome was not the tzitz of the Kohen Gadol, because they have a tradition which trumps the eyewitness testimony, and therefore the eyewitness testimony is to be explained that it is just another tzitz that they had, not the real tzitz. Now, so why does Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi then say that this is what would the Kohen Gadol, this is the din of the Kohen Gadol, this is the way the tzitz is supposed to be made. So he said that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi didn't have this tradition. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi himself did not receive the above tradition from his teacher like the Chachamim did. And accordingly, when he saw the forehead plate in Rome, the tzitz, he was not obligated to accept such an unlikely possibility that a tzitz, a forehead plate from a plate from another place, became intermingled with the instruments, the kelim, the big dekuna, the Beis Hamikdash, that the tzitz of the Kohen Gadol had not been copied, and the forehead plate he saw was not the real tzitz, but rather an ornament that someone made that not entirely resemble a tzitz. What leads us to say that type of entire type of pilpul, if you will? If you know that this is the way that tzitz is supposed to be, so how do you reconcile it with the eyewitness testimonies? You have to say there was other tzitzim made in similar ways. But if Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi did not receive such a tradition, there's nothing to force him to say that the tzitz that he saw in Rome was not the tzitz that they actually had in the Beis Hamikdash. Therefore, he brought proof from his observation that the words Kodesh LaHashem were engraved in one line on the tzitz. Nevertheless, since the Chachamim did have an accepted tradition regarding this matter, even eyewitness testimony did not cause them to contravene a tradition known to them. The rationale is that there is no possibility of doubt regarding the veracity of accepted tradition. When you have a Mesorah, when you have a Kabbalah from previous generations, this is the strongest testimony. By contrast, regarding Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi's eyewitness testimony, it is possible to say that the fire plate he saw was not the tzitz from the Kohen Gadol. Section 4. Based on the above, Rambam's ruling that the tzitz is valid after the fact, even though the two words were written in one line, requires serious analysis. If we're saying that the Chachamim had a Kabbalah that it's supposed to be written in two lines, the only reason that Rabbi Eliezer saw it, according to the Chachamim, that way in Rome, is because it was switched out for a different tzitz. So, how do we understand the Rambam now? In particular, this is true and like what was said above regarding there having been a tzitz that was acceptable only after the fact in the Beis Hamikdash for an extended time. The Rebbe, in other words, in the commentary or in the editor's explanation, he says as follows: the Rambam's ruling is somewhat self-contradictory. On one hand, he accepts the testimony of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi because he says that b'di'evet, after the fact, if it's written in one line, it's kosher. However, he accepts the Chachamim's position that the initial preferred option, you're supposed to make it on two lines. Now, if the tzitz that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi saw was in fact the real tzitz, how was it possible that it was used in Beis Hamikdash for an extended time? It is possible to explain the above by first posing a rhetorical question. As mentioned, the hypothesis is that the forehead plate Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi saw was made to prevent the Romans from taking the actual tzitz. How could they be fooled into thinking that they were taking the tzitz by replacing it with a forehead plate that did not resemble the one that had been used in the Beis Hamikdash at any time? The question is reinforced by the well-known fact that the Romans described the precise details of the Beis Hamikdash and its service in their books. So they had a knowledge of the Beis Hamikdash. They knew what was going on in the Beis Hamikdash. The Romans were ruling in Eretz Yisrael for quite a long time. They weren't just like, this is the first time they came into the Beis Hamikdash. They didn't know anything about Jews or Judaism. This was after years of being controlled in Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, it can be said that Rambam was forced to say that such a tzitz is valid after the fact, and that such a tzitz was actually worn at least for a short time, and that was how they fooled the Romans. Because if it wouldn't have been worn at all, so then the Romans wouldn't have been fooled. You couldn't have switched it out. And on the other hand, the fact that it was worn for a certain amount of time in the Beis Hamikdash, and that was how they fooled the Romans. So it must be that it's kosher to have that as well in the Beis Hamikdash. On the other hand, since the Chachamim say that you're not supposed to write it that way, you're supposed to write it in two lines, that means that's only a b'di'evet option. It's after the fact. Chaim goes further and writes that even the Chachamim, who ruled that Kodesh Lashem should be written in 2 lines, do not consider doing so as absolutely mandatory after the fact. The Ohr Chaim commentary on Chumash says that it's not that when the Rambam said that that the Chachamim held that it's not valid at all. B'diavad, it's totally not kosher. If you had it written on 1 line, it's unacceptable totally, even after the fact. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi holds that's the way it was done. So he says no, because then there would be like the stira. Who is the Rambam ruling like? Is he ruling like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi? Is he ruling like the Chachamim? So he says they do not consider doing so as absolutely mandatory after the fact. The Chachamim also will follow the view that the Rambam posited. The Rambam, when he said that the you should do it in 2 lines, but after the fact 1 line is okay, the Chachamim hold that way also. Hence, the Rambam's ruling in chapter 9 of Hilchos Kalei Migdash need not be questioned. It makes sense. According to the above explanation, it is possible to offer, at least as a hypothesis, another preferable reason for the Rambam's ruling, based on the principle that one should endeavor to minimize the amount of halachic differences of opinion. This is especially true since a straightforward understanding of Meiri's words implied that there was a difference of opinion with regard to a point of fact, which is very hard to say that there was such a thing. Thus, it is unnecessary to say, as hypothesized above, that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi did not receive the tradition that the 2 words should be written in separate lines. It could be said that he received that tradition, but considered it merely an initial preference. This is not the place for further discussion on the matter. In a footnote, the Rebbe explains that it's very possible to say that the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi don't even argue at all. That really the truth is, just like we said, that according to the Chaim, the Chachamim say that after the fact you could have it on 1 line. The same thing Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi says before the fact. In other words, initially, l'chatchila, you're supposed to have it on 2 lines. They're both talking about 2 different things. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi is just bringing a proof how after the fact it's valid because I saw it in Rome that way. Okay, that is the whole idea of the Sicha, how we explain the Rambam and how we explain the dispute of the Chacham and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi. And even if there is a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi and Chacham, very likely there isn't, like we just now suggested. So now the Rebbe says a practical application of this. There's so many different things. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have the Cairo Geniza, and all these different types of Genizas, which he's going to use the word over here as entombed. How much strength and how much validity are we supposed to give to these scrolls that we find, etc., etc.? So from what we just now learned, we see that it's very little value and strength should be given to those things. There is a point of instruction from the above discussion, a hira, that is relevant in our time. In recent years, Geniza scrolls and toned scrolls from portions of the Tanakh have been discovered. There are a number of differences between the manner certain words are written in these scrolls and the accepted tradition that we follow. So we have our Mesorah, again, like the Chachamim were testifying to their Mesorah, and then we see eyewitness, we see how the scrolls are written. It must be known that although these newly discovered scrolls are seemingly eyewitness evidence, Eidus Ria as it's called, they do not have the validity of our Mesorah, our tradition. This is especially true because there's no way of knowing whether or not the person who wrote the scroll was one of the Gedolei Chachamim. It's not like the case of Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi, who was reliable, and he was one of the great sages, like the Meiri calls him. We don't know who the authors was of these scrolls. Maybe it was just someone else that copied it over and made mistakes. We don't know the provenance of it. Furthermore, it is very possible that the reason the scroll was intoned was because it was written in a manner that's in opposition to Torah law. There's a halacha that if you make a mistake, if something is written incorrectly in the Torah scroll or other types of scrolls like that, what do? You don't throw out a sefer in the garbage. You put it into Geniza. So this is the same thing. They put these into the Geniza because it was wrong. So you can't bring a proof from Svarim there in the Geniza. It's very likely they were in the Geniza because they were mistaken. By contrast, the tradition we have received has been conveyed from teacher to student. The Kabbalah, the Masorah, is something that goes from Rebbe to Talmud, generation after generation, and a chain extending back to Moshe Rabbeinu. We can thus be certain that this tradition, this Masorah, is true.